And you see here the 7 factors that make a planet a Chidra Graha. Some are very easy to understand and recognize. So a planet that's Lord of the 8th house gets designated as a Chidra Graha. Planets in the 8th house. Planets even aspecting the 8th house. But then also what's called the Lord of the 22nd Drekana and the Lord of the 64th Navamsa, which I will explain more about in a moment. But then planets associated with the 8th house. Say a planet is conjunct the 8th Lord or in a mutual aspect with the 8th Lord. It can become also a Chidra Graha in this way. And then this is one of the more interesting ways in which a planet becomes a Chidra Graha. When it is the bitter enemy of the 8th Lord. Say, for example, that you have a Libra Lagna. Of course, the Lord of the 8th house would be Venus. Ironically, the 2 best benefics, Jupiter and Venus, are enemies to each other. So for anyone with Libra Lagna, with Venus as the 8th Lord, Jupiter, who would rule the 3rd and the 6th Lord for Libra, would also become a Chidra Graha. And vice versa. For a Taurus ascendant, for example, Jupiter becomes the 8th Lord, and therefore Venus, its bitter enemy, also becomes a Chidra Graha in that instance. But I want to say a little bit more about the planets that become Chidra Grahas as a result of being Lord of the 22nd Drekana or the 64th Navamsa. Now, first of all, everyone should understand that you're going to get this complete article and you'll be able to go through all the learning points and all the examples. And you'll see how the idea of the 22nd Drekana and the 64th Navamsa get derived. For our purposes here, I just actually want to explain the easy way to see these planets. In Navamsa, find the position of the moon and the 4th house, 4th sign from the moon in Navamsa. Any planets that are in that sign or any planet that's ruled that sign become Lord of the 64th Navamsa. This will become clear when I show examples. And then with regards to the 22nd Drekana, in the Drekana chart, D3, the planet, the sign, the house that is the 8th house of the Drekana, any planets in that sign, any planets ruling that sign of the 8th house of the Drekana now also become these Lord of the 64th, Lord of the 22nd Drekana, or placed in the 22nd Drekana, and therefore become Chidra Grahas. Now, I want to emphasize that just a planet becoming a Chidra Graha by itself won't necessarily cause a lot of difficulties when you run the periods of that planet. It's only when they have other qualifications to do so that they can become quite unfortunate. And actually, the classics of Jyotish actually state that in the major period of a strong Chidra Graha, a person can have great difficulties, and even if their ayus is up, if their longevity is up, it can bring about their passing. So to illustrate this, I want to show the chart of former U.S. President John F. Kennedy. And you'll note that in Kennedy's chart, he has what you would call a severe basic Arishta Yoga, an unfortunate combination related to the Lagna Lord that can give a lot of health problems, which he had, lifelong health problems. This comes about as a result of Mercury, as the Lagna Lord, goes to the 8th house with the 8th Lord, and then is also aspected by the 6th Lord, Saturn, while Saturn, the 6th Lord, also aspects the ascendant. So this was the karmic indications, you might say, in his chart that he would experience lifelong health problems, which he did, fairly severe. And then, of course, his life was cut short at a very young age. When he, at age 46, he was assassinated. So who then becomes the Chidra Grahas in this chart? Of course, Mars, as the 8th Lord in the 8th, becomes a Chidra Graha. Mercury, in 2 ways, because it's both in the 8th house and it's with the 8th Lord. And then you see that Saturn aspects onto the 8th house, and therefore it becomes a Chidra Graha also in that way. Now, he was assassinated in the major period of Jupiter and the sub-period of Saturn. So, of course, here Jupiter, as the 7th Lord, is playing the role of a primary Maraka, a planet that becomes eligible when a person's longevity is expired, that can bring their passing. And even though it has some good benefic influence, it's with a strong Venus, it's not combust, being with the sun here, you can see that it also gets malefically hemmed. You've got Ketu on one side and you've got Mars. Mercury becomes more malefic, being with a malefic. So this Jupiter, Amarika, 7th Lord, has this affliction. And then, of course, the sub-period of Saturn, which is a part of the primary Arishta Yoga that I outlined earlier, as it aspects this Mercury, the Lagna Lord, in the eighth with the eighth Lord as the sixth Lord, also aspecting the ascendant, as I mentioned previously. Now, what I want you to see based on the topic of my article is that the moon here, the Saturn here, which was the sub-period when he was assassinated, actually takes on the additional status of a Chidra Graha because it rules the sign that's the fourth from the moon in Navamsha. So the moon here in his Navamsha is in Scorpio. The fourth sign from there would be Aquarius, of course, ruled by Saturn. Now, it doesn't have any planets in there, but I just want to mention that if there were any planets in Aquarius, those would also become Chidragrahas as being in the 64th Navamsha. In this case, Saturn is the lord of the 64th Navamsha. Now, if you look at his Drekana, you will see that Jupiter is the eighth lord of the Drekana, and therefore also takes on this status of being a Chidra Graha. So my point here is that one of the astrological reasons that Jupiter as a major period, Saturn as a sub-period proved to be so unfortunate for him was not just based on their conditions in the birth chart, but also taking on this additional status of one being the lord of the 22nd Drekana and the other being the lord of the 64th Navamsha. Again, I want to reiterate that planets just taking on this status won't by themselves necessarily give unfavorable results. But if they are part of combinations in a horoscope that show the potential for that, then they most definitely add, you might say, to the unfavorableness. So this is what we mean when we talk about Chidra Grahas. So you'll see in the article, I take each of the 7 ways in which planets become Chidra Grahas, and I show examples of this. And I start here first by showing ways in which the eighth lord is behaving very, very badly. Now, I once wrote an article called The Agony and Ecstasy that gives a more balanced view of the eighth house, showing how the eighth house can actually give some extremely fortunate, extremely favorable type of experiences under the right conditions. Actually, the experience of samadhi, right, the experience of higher states of consciousness is actually a function of the eighth house, as is the awakening of Kundalini prior to experiencing those exalted higher states of consciousness. But of course, eighth house also indicates some of the worst expressions of human behavior. One of the indications given in the ancient text for the eighth house is the killing of a human being. So under the right conditions, an eighth lord can obviously bring extremely bad results. Now, I'm showing the chart of someone who at one point was a very popular entertainer. Him and his wife were a very popular singing duo at one point. But then later he got into politics and was actually a member of the US Congress. Focus in on Mars here. Mars, of course, for this Lagna is considered to be not only a natural malefic, but also is considered to be the worst functional malefic for this particular Lagna. And here, of course, it takes on the status of being a Chidra Graha, since it not only rules the eighth house, but it's also aspecting this eighth house. And here you can see it falls in the Maraka second house, right? All planets in or ruling the second or the seventh house take on the status of being what's called primary Marakas. And under the right conditions, they can cause difficulties or problems with health, bring about a health crisis, or under certain circumstances, they can also bring about a person's death. And you see here that Mars is also with Jupiter, who's another primary Maraka because it also rules the seventh house. So there was a tragic accident that he had. He was skiing. He was on a ski holiday, and he got out of control, and he slammed into a tree, and as a result suffered injuries that then resulted in his death in the Mars major period. So again, this is a planet, Chidra Graha, giving very bad results. Now, if I'm not mistaken, no, that's not correct. So, but again, I want to emphasize that without some indications in the birth chart to begin with that could indicate something like this, then this planet doesn't give this kind of result. You'll see here also Virgo Lagna, just like former U.S. President Kennedy, instead of the Lagna Lord going to the eighth with additional affliction, in this case, the Lagna Lord Mercury goes to the sixth, in the sixth house with the sixth Lord. Also, of course, with benefic influence, right? But there is, some potential here for suffering serious injuries through an accident, which is, of course, what happened. I want to point out that Jupiter here with Mars is not only a primary marker with respect to the birth chart, but if we see the moon in Navamsha, look at the fourth house from where the moon is positioned in Sagittarius, it becomes Pisces, which again is ruled by Jupiter. So Jupiter takes on this additional status of being the Lord of the 64th Navamsha. So this birth chart belongs to a very good friend of mine, someone that was my best friend growing up. And at the age of 16, he and the rest of his family suffered the agonizing experience of their father passing away due to a heart attack, right? And it happened in his Mars major period. So again, we see a eighth lord behaving rather badly. Here, Mars, of course, is in its debilitation sign. The sun is the karaka of father. And of course, so the sun here is getting afflicted. The sun, Karaka of father, is being afflicted here by this debilitated eighth lord. And by the way, you also see the aspect of Jupiter here, a strong Jupiter aspecting onto this configuration. But one principle that I've learned from Dr. K.S. Charik in his books on medical astrology is that a natural benefic like Jupiter that would normally protect this combination of Mars and the Sun, a retrograde planet won't necessarily protect as it ordinarily would. Right? So he had the experience of his father passing away in this Mars major period. Now, just go on to a little bit of a tangent here. I used to see my teacher, K.N. Rao, talk about how you can see events of your relatives in your own chart. And the technique was to use the associated house of that relative, see the dasha sequence that was running, and then you can see what it could mean for that particular individual. Well, father is ruled by the ninth house, right? And if you use the ninth house as a lagna, then the seventh house from there, the Maraka house, would be Scorpio and ruled by Mars, which is another way it could be seen that this person could lose their father in the Mars major period. The sub period, by the way, was the sub period of Venus. You'll see it's the ninth lord placed in the 12th house of loss under the influence of the Rahu Ketu axis. And of course, it's falling in the second house from this Mars. So, but what I want to highlight is that Mars is not only the eighth lord here, but if I show you I believe it's also the lord of the 22nd Dracana. I'm not showing the Dracana here, but I've stated here that Mars in this chart is also the lord of the 22nd Dracana. So it takes on additional malevolence as a result of that. So this was a chart that actually the father who owns, actually I think the uncle of, this is the chart of a young Indian girl living in England. I should start out by saying, and his uncle, who's a student of mine, wanted to discuss this chart because this young Indian woman living in England, I think she was in her early 20s, was experiencing such severe social anxiety in their Mercury major period that they were basically unable to function and basically weren't really interacting with anyone but their parents. They weren't able to work. They didn't have any social life, and basically they were housebound. So severe was their social anxiety. So again, we see an eighth lord behaving badly at Chidra Graha. But again, these Grahas won't necessarily do so, that is, produces very great difficulties, unless there's other additional reasons for that, meaning if they have additional afflictions. So this Mercury is a retrograde eighth lord. It's under the influence of the Rahu Ketu axis, which in my experience, Mercury under the influence of the Rahu Ketu axis can give anxiety disorders. And one principle that I very conscious of that I don't think is talked enough in the world of Jyotish is the way in which planets become associated, where they start to influence each other when they're Kendra Sambandha from each other, meaning they're in angles from each other. If you look in the Sanskrit classic Paladipika, it talks about the different ways in which planets can be associated and influencing each other. Of course, there's the conjunction, there's the mutual aspect, there's the exchange, but then it also says by Kendra Sambandha, and you'll find many yogas in the classics of Jyotish that come about as a result of planets being in angles from each other. So in this case with Mercury, this retrograde eighth Lord Mercury, it's not only under the influence of the Rahu Ketu axis, but I would also see it as being Kendra Sambandha to both Saturn and also Mars. And this is, in my view, an additional explanation as to why this Mercury major period is bringing this very unfavorable result. Um, so again, these are the eighth lord behaving badly. I think we've probably seen enough examples of this. I will, well, maybe, hold on. So now I want to talk about planets in the eighth house behaving very badly. This is one of the worst examples that you can find. Jeffrey Dahmer was a notorious serial killer. He uh, murdered and actually dismembered, kind of a horrific sort of thing, 17 men and boys during his Venus major period. And how could Venus be seen as being giving this kind of result? Well, first of all, you do see that it's in the eighth house, right, which represents the killing of a living human being. And then look at its degrees, 2853, right? It's rather in a Sunday position here. But really what you have to do is to see the afflictions. Um, it's mildly, I would say, it's hemmed by malefics somewhat mildly. You've got Mars on one side. The moon here is very dark and therefore does not count as a benefic. It has to count as a malefic. And then on the other side, you have the Sun and Mercury. So it's malefically hemmed. But what you need to also see, I do take the aspect of Rahu, the 5 and 9 aspect from Rahu. And you see here that Venus at 2853 of Aries is almost in an exact aspect from Mars at 29 of Rahu. And he actually committed his first murder in the Venus Rahu period and subperiod. So this is again an example of a planet that is a Chidra Graha, but then also has other uh, negative influences on it that then gives this kind of extreme result in this case. And once again, I want to highlight that you see the aspect of a strong Jupiter, but again, retrograde. And coming back to this idea that retrograde benefic, and I found this to be quite valid as an interpretive principle, retrograde benefic won't protect as it otherwise might if it were not retrograde. Then I'm showing here the chart of another US President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And some of you may be aware that I think it was around age 38, 39, he was stricken by the polio virus, and it rendered him unable to use his lower limbs for the rest of his life. So he was in a wheelchair. It obviously didn't prevent him from having a hugely successful life and having a hugely successful political career. And this would have happened in the Saturn major period. So we see here Saturn becoming a Chidra Graha. Why? Because it's in the eighth house. Of course, it's in its debilitation sign. But again, it's in the context of a horoscope that you can see some arishta, some unfortunate combination in regards to the health. Because you see here the Lagna Lord Mercury goes to the sixth house. Mars as a Chidragraha eighth lord aspects the ascendant. And this is this experience of becoming paralyzed from the waist down occurred in his Saturn major period and the subperiod of Rahu. Rahu, of course, giving the results of Mars, but then also see the 6-8 positional relationship between Saturn as the major period lord and Rahu as the subperiod lord. So this is examples of planets in the eighth house giving a bad result. This is a chart of an Indian woman who actually quite a brilliant student of Jyotish of mine. But when she moved into the Saturn major period, you see the danger, right? Saturn, of course, is right there in the eighth house, and it's couldn't hardly be more under the influence of Rahu Ketu because it's both are at 4 degrees. And you can see here that it actually has an exchange with Mercury, the eighth lord. So, Ketu, by the way, rules viruses. And she's someone who she likes to travel the world. That's one of the ways in which she enjoys life. She's a world traveler. She had gone to Iceland just after she moved into the Saturn major period, Saturn, and she was stricken by a virus that attacked her lungs. And it got very serious. She was in the hospital. She was on a respirator, and then she got sepsis, a kind of a poisoning of the blood that can be extremely dangerous. And she was kind of in a situation where she could have died. Thankfully, she did not. She did survive, but it was very life-threatening situation. So again, we have, and by the way, again, another principle from medical astrology that I've found to be very valid is that when natural malefics are retrograde, then their influence is more malefic. So we see here that the Saturn is not just in the eighth house, but it's also retrograde and so closely conjunct Ketu. I won't use the. So I'd shown John Kennedy's chart before, and I just want to show this example again because one of the ways in which a planet becomes a Chidra Graha is when it's just aspecting the eighth house, and here you have Saturn as a sixth lord aspecting onto the eighth house. And again, it was in a Saturn sub-period that he was assassinated. I'm addressing, I think, primarily an Indian audience, so you should probably recognize the names Sanjay Dutt. He's a Hollywood Bollywood actor, and some of you may be aware that some while back he was diagnosed with lung cancer. Lungs are a indication of the fourth house. This was happening in his Saturn major period. And you see here that Saturn is a retrograde Saturn in the Maraka second house. This is a way in which it becomes dangerous to the health. And I believe it was in the sub-period of K2. And what needs to be seen here about that is a Sukshma Parivartana Yoga, a subtle exchange between Saturn and Ketu, which is why this particular period and sub-period could produce the result and that it did. Saturn is in Mula, Ketu's nakshatra, while Ketu is in Uttara Bhadrapada, which is Saturn's nakshatra. And it's one of the ways in which planets can become very connected, in which case you have to see this Saturn also getting the affliction, you might say, of the Rahu-Ketu axis. Fortunately, he was successfully treated and, apparently is now cancer-free. This is actually a rather extreme case of Chidra grahas causing a real life-altering, tragic type of experience. You can see in this chart the static potential for vehicular accidents causing bodily injury. You should all be aware that the natural karaka for vehicles, vahanas, as it's said in the ancient text, is Venus. And you see here Venus being quite afflicted. It's both in a mutual aspect with Mars as the Lagna Lord, but also the sixth Lord of accidents. And it's also it's also an exchange. So this Venus, Karaka vehicles, is very strongly under the influence of Mars, and Mars as a sixth Lord. And then also gets the aspect of Saturn. So you see the potential for vehicular accidents affecting the body, as you see here. But now come to the major period of Mercury. Mercury is a Chidra Graha, being the Lord of the eighth. Most of you should be aware that for anyone with Scorpio Lagna, Mercury is considered the worst functional malefic. And then here it's retrograde and it's aspected by Mars also. Now, again, I want to highlight that it's in Jupiter, sign aspected by Jupiter, but Jupiter's retrograde here. And according to this principle that I've been talking about, in my experience, it won't necessarily protect as it otherwise would if it were not retrograde. So in his Mercury major period, one night he was driving in the nighttime on a country road, and out of nowhere, his car got struck by another vehicle that was being operated by a drunk driver, and it resulted in life-altering injuries. The sub-period here was actually Venus. With all this affliction, as you can see, it's also a Maraka, seventh lord. Marakas become more dangerous when they are in the influence of natural malefics. And of course, the positional relationship between Mercury and Venus is 212. That is, Venus falls in the 12th house from Mercury. So now I want to show specifically examples of the Chidra grahas that become Chidra grahas because they are the lord of the 64th Navamsha or the 22nd Rekana, or they're placed in these. So look at Venus in this horoscope. It becomes a Chidra graha in a variety of different ways, right? First of all, it becomes a Chidra graha because it is is with the eighth lord. It also becomes a Chidra graha because it aspects onto the eighth house itself. And again, it has some affliction by natural malefics because both Mercury and Venus in the second house get the aspect of Mars, right? Now, you can see in Navamsha the position of the moon here. So planets that are in or ruling the fourth house from the moon in Navamsha become Chidra grahas. So Venus here, excuse me, Venus here becomes a Chidra graha because it's the lord of the 64th Navamsha. Ketu and Mars become Chidra grahas because they are falling in the 64th Navamsha. And then in the Drekana, how do we see planets who become Chidra grahas? We see planets in or ruling the eighth house from the Lagna of D3. So we have the moon that's there, but remember, Venus is the lord of the 64th Navamsha, and it's also the lord of the 22nd Drekana. So it becomes quite the Chidra graha in a variety of different ways. Right? So in this person's Venus-Mercury period and sub-period, they were hospitalized for a sort of a serious sort of medical condition. And they did, in fact, fortunately survive, but it was a health crisis situation. Basically, it was the period and sub-period of two Chidra grahas, who, of course, also become primary Marakas. I once wrote an article about certain periods and sub-periods that I have seen over and over again that can bring danger to the health. And that is when you're running the major period of a primary Maraka with affliction, and then the sub-period of a trick house lord with affliction. Now, those two additional qualifications are very important because we should be very clear. You can be running a Maraka period and not so much as catch a cold. Maraka periods won't always be dangerous periods. But in this case, because Mercury is the eighth lord as primary Maraka, Venus is the seventh lord as a primary Maraka, and both of them do have that additional affliction. They get the aspect of Mars as the sixth lord. It was actually quite predictable that the Mercury-Venus period and sub-period is going to be, it did prove to be dangerous, but again, they were able to recover. It wasn't so life-threatening. Now you'll see that Saturn in this horoscope and all its qualifications to cause trouble by its affliction onto Mercury, a Maraka seventh and sixth lord sun, right? So we have Mars here. I'm sorry, we have Mercury here as a primary Maraka. Okay. And then what makes it dangerous? It makes it dangerous because it's with the sixth lord sun. And then it's also aspected by the natural malefic Saturn retrograde, who's also a 12th lord. And if you look in Navamsha, you would see that the fourth sign from the moon in Navamsha is Capricorn. Therefore, Saturn becomes also a Chidra graha. My point being that it's affliction to Mercury as a mark, a seventh lord, with a sun as the sixth lord, becomes more dangerous. So in the major period of Mercury, subperiod of K2, think about K2. K2 is also a Marika because it's in the second house. It's with Venus, a natural benefic, but who's also the eighth lord for this Lagna. It falls K2 as a subperiod, falls 12th from Mercury. So what happened in this period, Mercury K2, is that they were basically out shopping for fruits in a farmer's market, and all of a sudden they just fell over. They'd had a stroke. Uh, Fortunately, they actually fell into a bunch of fruit. It would have broken their fall, or they might have suffered worse from the fall. But as a result, they did have a stroke, and for a period of time, they had speech impairment and also cognitive impairment, which is oftentimes it happens when a person has a stroke. Fortunately, they completely recovered. And so, but this Mercury K2 period and subperiod, what I'm highlighting here is how Mercury takes on a particular difficult status here, but then is aspected by Saturn, who's not only natural malefic, who's not only retrograde, who's not only the 12th lord, but is also a Chidra grahas. So planets that have a number of qualifications to cause trouble. This is when they're running periods where planets are affected by them. This is where these things can happen. Obviously, this is not a happy topic, folks. I'm talking about planets that can cause a lot of difficulties in life. So. Uh, Sunil, I don't know how we're doing time-wise. How much time do I have left?
Yeah, it's okay. Up to you, Mark.
Well, okay, but we talked about a certain time limit. I don't want to go,
Uh,
just let me
another
know,
five,
just let me
five,
know when it's
another
time to
5, 10
stop.
minutes.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Sure, no, that's fine.
Thank you.
So thus far we've talked about planets that become Chidra grahas because they are ruling the eighth, because they are in the eighth, because they're aspecting the eighth house, right? And now I'm going to talk about planets that become Chidragrahas by being associated with the eighth lord. I'm showing up the chart of a very famous Hollywood movie star, Elizabeth Taylor, who throughout her life had many, I outlined this in the article, you'll see all this. She had many, many major illnesses. She had many injuries and, chronic sort of health problems. And twice doctors had sort of said that, she wouldn't survive, and she was able to. But, just really with a lot of problems in her inner health is what she experienced. Oops. So you see here that the Lagna Lord Mars is in the fourth house with the Sun, and they actually form a very good 110 Raja Yoga in the fourth house, right? But you can see that Mercury is also there. And this actually had a lot to do with our Lagna Lord conjunct the eighth Lord. And you'll see there that this Mercury is very, very close to the Sun. So it has that condition of being, strongly under the influence of the sun there in a combustion kind of situation. And so just even the Lagna Lord conjunct the eighth Lord, it would be an affliction in particular, because of course Mars is not only the eighth Lord, it's also the sixth Lord here. But I want to highlight something here. You can see that these planets are in Mercury's in Satabisha. And some of you I know are very familiar with the nakshatras. And her Lagna Lord Mars is afflicted by this malignant eighth Lord, eighth Lord Mercury, and they're in Satabisha, which some of the symbolism is 100 physicians. And Mars too also becomes a Chidragraha. The ascendant is afflicted by Mandi. So these are some of the indications that this could be someone who suffers a lot of difficulty and health problems in their life. So remember what I said earlier about major periods when a planet is a primary marker with affliction. And then the sub-period of a trick house lord, someone who rules either the 6th, 8th, or 12th houses, but then also with affliction. You'll see here that Venus and Saturn qualify as being such a combination. Venus is a Maraka second lord, and it's under all affliction. It's with Mars, the eighth lord, and therefore becomes a Chidra Graha. Whenever planets are with the eighth lord, this is one of the ways they become a Chidra Graha. This would be true of Venus here. Of course, they're additionally under the influence of the Rahu Ketu axis, and Ketu, Mars, and Venus all aspected by Saturn, who's a sixth lord, who also has affliction because it's in a mutual aspect with Mars, the eighth lord. So during this period and sub-period, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. But fortunately, the cancer was detected in early stages and he was able to be successfully treated. But obviously, this was a life-threatening type of situation. Now, I said, one of the more unusual ways in which a planet can become a Chidra Graha is when they are the bitter enemy, the enemy of the eighth lord. I'm showing you the chart of an individual, rather a sad, deluded soul who became under the influence of a cult leader, a man by the name of Charles Manson. And she was responsible, along with others of his cult, for some horrendous murders that took place back in August in 1969 here in the U.S. This is one of the women who was involved in committing those murders, or one of those murders. And you can see, remember my saying that the eighth house, eighth lord, one of the indications is that you can relate to the killing of a living human being. And you can see here that this Jupiter in its debilitation sign in the sixth house rules the eighth, and it was in the major period of Jupiter that she committed these murders, but it was in the sub period of Venus. So for anyone with Leo Lagna, there Jupiter is the eighth lord, who is again the bitter enemy of the Jupiter. It's Venus. So Venus here takes on this also the status of being a Chidra Graha, and you can see that it's also quite afflicted. It's in its debilitation sign. It's under the influence of the Rahu Ketu axis. And it's also aspected by Mars. So it was in this Jupiter-Venus period and subperiod, I believe, under the influence of drugs and under the influence of this cult leader, that she actually ended up murdering someone senselessly and spent, as a result, the rest of her life in prison. Now, you'll see that, yeah, that's mostly what I wanted to say about that particular example. And, these are really challenging horoscopes here. This is the chart of another serial killer, murderer, who actually was confessed to having murdered up to 30 women, young women. And this was all taking place in his Venus period. Now you see Jupiter here again becomes the eighth lord. And then therefore it becomes a Chidra Graha, right? Because it's Venus then becomes a Chidra Graha by virtue of the fact that it's with Jupiter, the eighth lord. It's retrograde here, and I want you to see that all of these two planets, Venus and Jupiter here, are Kendra Sambandha, that is an angular relationship by Saturn as a sixth and seventh lord. And therefore I would see them also influencing this Venus-Jupiter combination. And as I mentioned, all these murders took place in the Venus major period. But then you also have to see, the whole context of the chart. You've got the Lagna Lord here. You've got all these planets in Scorpio, extremely dark moon in its debilitation sign. Mars, Rahu Ketu, Sun here, the Lagna Lord, in something called Sarpa Draconis. There are certain 10-degree segments of the zodiac and water signs that are designated in the classics as Sarpa Draconis. Again, they can give rise to very terrible acts in different actions, as in this case. His murders were sort of psychosexual in nature. And this is kind of an expression of these combinations in Scorpio and the afflictions and so on. Now, some of you have, of course, seen the chart of Donald Trump, who is now, unfortunately, according to my opinion, the President of the United States. And, he's running currently the period of Jupiter, major period, and Venus as a sub-period. And again, I don't wish ill on anyone. I wish he wasn't the President of the United States anymore. But I've actually told students of mine in analyzing this chart and some of what this period and sub-period can bring, that I believe before it's over, he will experience a fairly severe health crisis. Again, I go back to those period and sub-periods I've been talking about. His major period is Jupiter, and it's in the second Marca house, right? And then it's aspected by Saturn, who's both a sixth lord and a Marca seventh lord. And then Venus. Venus, of course, is in the 12th house, and it's also closely conjunct and afflicted by Saturn, again, the sixth lord and a Marca seventh lord. But if you look at his Navamsha, you can see that Mercury here is the lord of the 22nd Drekana. I'm not sure, I'm sharing, yeah. So really that's they don't become Chidra grahas in other ways. But it's the major period. The point of what I'm making about Jupiter Venus is again this idea of how a planet becomes a Chidra graha by being the bitter enemy of the eighth lord. So again, we have Leo Lagna. It's the ruler of the eighth. And then Venus is its bitter enemy. He's running that sub-period. It is in the 12th house. It has this affliction. So it remains to be seen. And it's known that he does have some health problems. He has some circulation problems that have resulted in swelling in his ankles because they're not, the veins in his legs are not operating as they should. Again, I don't wish the man ill, but I'd be surprised if in this period and sub-period before it's over, that there isn't some rather health crisis based on what I'm talking about here. Okay. I've had my own experience of Chidra grahas, and maybe I'll end with this particular note. You'll actually see in my horoscope some of the same Arishta combinations that exist in the chart of John F. Kennedy, in the sense that I am Virgo Lagna with the Lagna Lord Mars in the eighth house with the eighth Lord. The difference in my chart and his is that a strong Jupiter, not retrograde, aspects my ascendant, which brings about what's called Arishta Bhanga, or some cancellation of the Arishta. And also the planets in the eighth house are very benefically hemmed with Jupiter in its own sign on one side and Venus in its own sign on the other. So really, I haven't had the lifelong health problems that it was characteristic of Kennedy's life. But understandably and predictably, I should say, when I was running the major period of Mars, sub-period of Mercury, which of course is activating Chidra grahas. Mercury is the Lagna Lord in the eighth with the eighth Lord, also with the 12th Lord. I was in university, I was in my college days, I was a basketball player, and I tore ligaments and cartilage in my right knee and had to undergo an operation to repair those. So particularly Mars, Mercury brought about this injury and health crisis. And then later, when I ran Saturn, Mercury, Saturn, of course, is a retrograde malefic in the first house, afflicting the ascendant. And when I ran Saturn Mercury, I had traveled to India and then Bali and picked up some intestinal parasites that really wreaked havoc with my GI tract for a period of time, about 6 weeks. This is probably the sickest that I've ever been. So again, you see here the operation of Chidra grahas that are also have some additional qualification to bring some health difficulties. But overall, I've actually been blessed with good health because of the factors that help cancel the Arishta here. So this is what I had to share with you today. I don't know, Sunil, do we take any questions at this point or no?
Yeah, thanks. Kindly raise hands. We can take one or two questions if anybody has it. Kindly raise your hands.
I want to mention also that this article that you're seeing is something that you'll all be able to get a copy of, right? So you can go through all the examples. I wasn't able to cover everything in the limited amount of time here. I see a raised hand.
Ruchi,
English.
Ruchi Datta, sorry. Okay.
Good evening, sir. Good
Good
evening,
evening.
Mark, sir. Very, very, very enlightening presentation, sir. Fantastic lecture. So, just one doubt that when we see the bitter enemy, are we going to take natural or are we going to take functional?
No, that's a very good question. Not the temporary enemies, just the natural enemies. All right. So all planets, not all planets, but everyone has planets that they're friends with, or they're neutral with, or they're enemies with. So just the enemy. I've been using the example of Jupiter and Venus, they're enemies, right? So that's a good clarifying question. And this isn't a very happy topic, obviously, right? My next presentation will not be so depressing. I guarantee you, right? But of course, people falling ill and being injured, these things are a part of life, and since they're a part of life, they're a part of what gets reflected astrologically. Any other
Absolutely,
question?
sir. But thank you so much for clarifying.
Sure, you're welcome. Do we have another question here? Someone else has their hand up, I noticed.
Tommy.
Yes, thank you, sir. It's a very profound session. One question I have, normally we take a conjunction of 5 to 6 degree, but here wherever the 8th lord is sitting, we are taking conjunctions of 20-25 degree also, I saw. So should we take the conjunction of 20-25 degree also?
Yeah. So obviously some planets are more conjunct falling in the same sign as other planets, right? But generally speaking, if two planets are in a sign, they should be considered influencing each other. But I want to also